Today is October 9th, 2012. My name is Avi Master. I'm interviewing Sheila Malcolm, who has been a leader, a mover, a shaker in the Colorado Congregation for Humanist Judaism, also known as Beth Ami, which is part of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And we're here today just to find out more about Sheila, what she's done in Boulder, and how she's contributed to Jewish life and the Jewish community.
Thank you.
The interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program and for the Jewish Oral History Project. And the interview is being filmed by Anne Marie Poise, who has a tremendous amount of poise, I might say. Okay, so we're going to start with the obvious question. When and where were you born?
Well, I was born in the year 1954 in a small town called the Bronx, New York City. And I grew up on Sedgwick Avenue in a wonderful mixed building neighborhood community, which, as far as my Jewishness, was probably mostly Jewish, but also was filled with Irish and Italian Catholic families. And as far as the Jewish community went, people who I learned had been survivors of the Holocaust, who were my neighbors down the hall, as well as communist laborer party workers and co-op builders in the socialist movement, a wonderful, diverse, Orthodox to secular extreme of people.
Very interesting. And can you tell us a little bit about your parents, when they came to the United States, how they met?
Sure. My four grandparents were all immigrants from Eastern Europe. My maternal parents from what is now Belarus, and my paternal parents from what is now Hungary. But actually, they were probably a little more than a stone's throw from each other as far as their beginnings, because of the changing boundaries of Eastern Europe. So they all arrived in the early 1900s. My parents were born and raised in the Bronx of immigrant parents who stressed education and cleanliness and making your way in the world as the most important things, although with fairly different perspectives. So my father's family was very orthodox and ruled with an iron fist by my grandfather. My mother's family was very socialist and progressive. And so even though my parents met and fell in love, much to the chagrin of their parents, they managed to marry and raise 3 children in the Bronx also, which is where my siblings and I were raised.
What did your grandparents do?
They got by. They peddled, they pushed carts, they sold whatever was available to sell. My father's father was actually employed by the Manischewitz company, so eventually ended up in the matzah industry. My mother's father was a true entrepreneur. And when we were children, he told us various stories about how he should have made it in America, as he said at the time. So he claimed to be the first person who invented ice cream on a stick dipped in melted chocolate and sold on the street corner for a penny a pop, but that the good humor industry got in the way of his success. He also sold shirts in push carts, and his secret was to remove the labels, the size labels of the shirts, so that when a woman came up to him and would say, "I need a large white shirt for my husband," he would just hand her a shirt as quickly as possible, and she would say, "There's no size on it." He'd say, it's a large, of course. And that's how he got by. He also worked in the garment industry in Lower Manhattan and sewed women's coats and dresses and shirtwaists for what was original ladies.
And how did your parents meet from such a completely different background?
They met through mutual friends, and I don't remember all the details, but I know that it was a very kind of platonic friendship, and I do remember being told that they went ice skating. And my mother was a proficient ice skater, my father was not. So I think that's how they started their relationship. She was in charge from the very beginning.
Oh, I see. I was going to say something like he helped her up.
I think it was the other way around. She was a true assertive woman, even back then.
And did she end up going into any kind of profession? Was she a full-time?
So my parents' lives were both interrupted by World War II. My father enlisted and trained in the Army, was never sent overseas. By the time the war ended, he was still in training here in the United States. My mother stopped her degree, which was, I think, she was planning to be a nurse initially, did some nursing training and did some assisting during the war. By the time they get married, she assumed the role of homemaker and raised 3 children in an apartment in the Bronx, and did what was expected of her at that time in that milieu, which was to wear those shirtwaist dresses and to educate her children, to make sure that they were provided for and their lives were enriched in cultural ways. We lived in New York City and we had many cultural opportunities available to us. We went to the parks for nature, and we went upstate New York, which was really at that time for us maybe 30 to 50 miles outside of New York City, now considered true suburbs. But for me and my siblings, that was nature. That was where we saw animals in the wild, in addition to the Bronx Zoo. That was another very special place as far as expanding our horizons about the world.
And what did your father do?
My father became a civil engineer after the war. He took advantage of the scholarships available and attended City College in Manhattan for an engineering degree, and worked pretty much his whole life for the city of New York in their civil engineering department. A lot of people are familiar with the landfill that occurred on the western part of Manhattan, which moved into the Hudson River due to trash landfill, which was engineered by city engineers, which now houses places like Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center campus, which ironically is where my daughter ended up working when she moved to New York City about 6 years ago, on my father's landfill.
Wow. And how was Judaism expressed in your family, since it was, there was one Orthodox and one, socialist progressive? How did they integrate that, and how were you raised?
I would say that's one place where my mother deferred to my father. So we lived in proximity to what was then called the Van Cortlandt Jewish Center. When I Googled it recently, it was called a modern Orthodox congregation. It moved to directly across the street from our apartment building. Prior to that, when I was a young child, it was housed in an old single-family building right next to Van Cortlandt Park, which is where I often went to play. And it was an old, dark, heavy, wooden building where a lot of elderly people gathered for services, and where I remember going as a child. The other very strong memory I have is moving from the old building into the new Van Cortlandt Jewish Center, right across the street from my home, so that I could look from my bedroom window to my shul. And the moving day involved literally carrying the Torah, the Ark, and the other ritual pieces of the old center to the new building, which was a huge parade, which might have looked like something from a shtetl from 100 years earlier, but it was through the streets of the Bronx, about a half a mile away in total, through the neighborhood, and then the Torahs were embedded into their new ark in the new building, which was a modern, glass-windowed, light-filled Jewish center.
And how do you remember a feeling about being Jewish as you were growing up? Was it something of great pride to you? Was it integral to your life?
It was definitely integral to our lives, so that the holiday rituals, the annual celebrations, the fact that I was enrolled in Sunday school, in Hebrew school, and then was destined to be at the time bas mitzvahed, what we say now is bat mitzvah usually, because this was a more traditional congregation. The old phrasing of Hebrew was used. So I was among 5 girls who received the first bas mitzvah celebration at Van Cortlandt Jewish Center in 1967. And we were all 13 or 14 at the time. There were 6 of us, and I do remember my very good friend dropped out. And I also dropped out a number of times. And the process for fixing that situation is that I would come home from PS 95, my elementary school on Sedgwick Avenue, and the rabbi would be in my living room wanting to have a little chat. So I always succumbed to that little chat, returned to Hebrew school until my bas mitzvah occurred with my 5 female colleagues, which was kind of fun. Although by that point I was in junior high, I was of ready to move on, ready to delve into different areas of my life. So before I had those choices, before the world opened up to me, Judaism was there. It was Friday night candles, it was chicken soup, it was celebrating holidays, it was always gatherings with the grandparents, the aunts and uncles and the cousins. It was a very traditional model of family life in the 50s and early 60s.
I'm thinking, because you have been such a leader in the secular humanist movement, do you remember when you first started questioning the theistic component of Judaism?
That's a great question. I think that happened before my bas mitzvah time. I think that I was the student in Hebrew school who would question the rabbis when things were just told to us as fact. I don't believe I ever really had a God gene, and I'm going to be very open about that. It was never clear to me to whom we were praying. It was never clear that there was an evidence that there was a higher power or a deity. I was not a scientist, but I was a questioner. And when my questions weren't answered, I became very suspicious. So by the time I was a teenager, I think I was self-identified as an atheist, but as a Jewish atheist, because I do believe that our culture is our culture. And though we can embrace other cultures, we are, in many ways, who we're born to be. And I was a Jew. I love Jewish culture. I love the arts. I love the music and the liturgy and the texts and the fact that the old liturgy and books and Torah and Mishnah and everything else that goes with it is old, but it has significant messages for us today. That was never reason enough for me to embrace prayer and belief in a faith that I simply couldn't muster. And so I spent a lot of years searching for what that next step might be. I married a Catholic man, and we homeschooled our children in religion, and we searched together for the commonalities of traditional religion, and we raised our children in an ethical, humanistic manner. And so I started moving into the arts and the liturgy and the music and the stories and eventually the movies, the films, of how to instill that ethical, humanistic, cultural aspect of life in my own children, because I am a teacher. And that became my own version of being a humanistic Jew with a secular overlay, because I couldn't present to my children what I didn't believe myself.
How do you distinguish the secular from the humanist? What's the
I think many of us are humanist, and many of us would say that we are humanists in our value systems. To me, the secular overlay is that I don't have a God belief. I don't have a deity to whom I pray. I believe that the world is filled with blessings, with gratitudes, with opportunities to take advantage of nature. Some would call it a spirituality, but I'm a little on the fence with that term, although I embrace that term when other people use it. I simply do not pray to a higher power, and I couldn't impose that on the students that I taught, on my children when I had them, and eventually I have a wonderful story about finding Humanistic Judaism, which already was available on a plate for me to eat from, which was just a wonderful eye-opening opportunity about 15 years ago.
About 15 years ago. I was going to ask,
Yeah.
when did that happen?
Yeah.
Let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
I also was someone who married a non-practicing Catholic man, raised 3 children. How do your children now practice Judaism or not practice Judaism? You had 2 children?
I have 2 children. My daughter's now 29 and my son is 26. They both live in New York City. So one of those circular events that occurred for very good reasons and for wonderful reasons. So they are now embedded in a Jewish cultural atmosphere. They identify as Jews culturally. They don't identify as religious observers, although they've certainly been exposed to the world. They've both traveled extensively in the United States and around the world. They've met people from all persuasions. They've attended religious services of all persuasions, and they seem to be following in my footsteps in many ways as far as embracing that Jewish cultural aspect but not being religious at all.
You must be really proud.
I am.
Really proud. Have they gotten married?
No. I don't want to take on too much of a stereotypical Jewish mama bent here, but my daughter is in a long-term relationship with a wonderful man who is not
Jewish.
From the Jewish community, and my son is not involved. So they have many Jewish and non-Jewish friends, and the wonderful thing by being in New York City is that they've both become part of my extended family. So my cousins are now their surrogate parents in New York City, and my cousins' children are their friends. So we've completed another circle. It's terrific.
All right, so let's get back to.
Okay.
I want to find out about this discovery of secular Judaism on a plate.
You got it.
To you.
I can explain
How did that happen?
So in the early 1980s, I became friends with a couple who live in Boulder. Their names are Rena and Hillel Siegel. And Rena was a dancer, and she started an Israeli dance group of like-minded, mostly Jewish women who loved Israeli music and dance. So we got together and we practiced and we became friends, and we did some little performances and had some little costumes and had a really good time doing that for several years. Rena and Hillel at that time were attending the brand new congregation that was forming in Denver called the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, which was formed by a group of people who got together in each other's living rooms and followed and read about the teachings of Rabbi Sherwin Wine. So a little background info about Rabbi Wine. From the Detroit area, his parents were both Holocaust survivors. He grew up and celebrated and conducted himself as a Jew, went to seminary, became a Reform rabbi, was a chaplain in the Korean War, came back, had a congregation, and decided through the course of his philosophic training and background, a brilliant man, that he really was an atheist after all of that effort, and shared that with his congregation, many of whom said, we kind of feel the same way. And so he started using his wonderful brain and his wonderful energy and background in philosophy and researching the history of Judaism, and found out that over the centuries there was evidence of great Jewish thinking without a belief in a deity, much to our surprise. And so he formulated in the early 60s a movement In Detroit, he was called the Atheist Rabbi. He was written up in many local media, and word spread mostly to Chicago, around the Midwest, to the coasts, and Humanistic Judaism was born. Rabbi Sherwin Wine was the force of nature behind it. Unfortunately, he passed away 4 years ago in an unexpected auto accident in Morocco, where he was traveling. He still had incomplete work, which had not been published at the time, which is being published by his descendants, his rabbinical descendants, who are now assuming the reins of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, based in Farmington Hills, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. And the legacy grows. There are now about 30 congregations in the United States, Toronto. I think there are a few more being nurtured and grown around the United States and Canada. There are international congregations around the world, and there's a very wonderful and growing movement in Israel called MROHP, which is headed up by a female rabbi named Sivan Mas, who I had the pleasure of meeting several times, most recently in Israel this past May. So the movement is growing. The idea that you can be Jewish and cultural resonates with many, many people, and the idea that if you're not sure that there's a God, or you're not comfortable saying words that you don't believe to be true, this might be a Jewish opportunity. In fact, Rabbi Wine believed that this was a growing and significant new branch of Judaism, and it was a viable opportunity for thousands of people around the world.
And how does it work? Like when you're in, do you go to synagogue? You have a synagogue. Beth Ami is a synagogue.
Beth Ami is a congregation, although we don't have a brick and mortar building. So to backtrack, we did eventually form a Boulder group, which meshed with the Denver group a few years ago to become Beth Ami / Colorado Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. It's a mouthful of a name.
Yes.
It extends geographically from Highlands Ranch to Boulder County. So we have involved congregants filling in that geographic area. Because we're still fairly small and not well endowed financially, we don't have a building. We have decided that that's intentional, and that works really well for our model of going to meet people where they are. So we have chosen several different venues over the years, and we now meet in downtown Denver, in Westminster, and in several other areas, including Jefferson Unitarian Church in Golden, for our larger events. And we rent space without having the overhead of a building. We don't have a rabbi. We have 2 female leaders who are madrichot, the plural of madricha, meaning teacher or leader. So my colleague, Michelle Davis, who lives in Highlands Ranch, and I are the 2 coordinated leaders of Beth Ami. We also have, and we provide life cycle events, holiday celebrations, Shabbat and Havdalah services, and we have a wonderful website where everything is located as far as people checking us out. We also do life cycle events. Rabbi Wine pointed to me in 2006 when he came out to Denver to visit and invited me, assertively, to go through the leadership training. 4 years later, I graduated from, we'll just let that go, from the training, and hopefully that can be blocked out, from the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism training for leadership. We'll just pause for a minute.
We're now going to hear your voice answering it.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully nobody's leaving a message. I was just going to talk about her, and she called. Lenore, who's on the phone right now, is the director of our Jewish Cultural School, and she's leaving me a message about something. So we're in constant contact. She also came from the Detroit congregation where Rabbi Wine was highly influential. Now, I'm going to use that as an example. Some would say, oh my goodness, I was just about to talk to Lenore and she called on the phone. That's not my take on it. I believe that that was just a coincidence, that Lenore was planning to call me this morning. And although I was getting ready to speak her name, I don't believe that there was any divine intervention in that process, although that might be a way of differentiating my take on Judaism as opposed to a more traditional focus. So, as I was saying.
Yeah, so you completed the program. You're now you're called a leader.
In addition to leading the congregation, being the de facto leaders, Michelle and I perform life cycle events. So I've performed 12 weddings in the last 4 years, and they've been wonderful, mostly interfaith weddings. I feel that I offer a service to couples, old and young. Many have been second marriages, so that their weddings can be done in a secular way, so that they're usually outdoors or in a home or in a non-religious location, and they're beautiful ceremonies to which there's no deity involved, but there is humanism and heartfelt feeling and prayer that involves appreciation of finding each other or being in a beautiful setting or welcoming the friends and relatives who attend without actually praying to a God. We've done bar and bat mitzvahs, b'nai mitzvot. For our community, we now have a growing Sunday school population, a Jewish cultural school is what we call it. We've now had 7 bar and bat mitzvahs performed, and we have a wonderful teenage population who are all becoming young leaders in very different and wonderful ways. Our Jewish cultural school has about 20 children. We meet every other Sunday in Golden at the, actually Westminster, at the at the Countryside Rec Center in Westminster, where we kind of take over from the fall to the spring and have adult ed side by side with Jewish cultural school for children.
And how does it work? Like when you're having your services or when you're teaching, do you like leave out big chunks of that, anything that refers to, you say Baruch. I mean, how does it work? You just leave out all the parts that refer to
I can actually
a higher
give you
power?
a wonderful sample of that. So for lighting candles or saying wine blessings or blessings over the bread, chamotzi, traditionally there's a blessing that says Baruch atah Adonai, blessing to God. And if you translate the Hebrew, what you're really doing is thanking God for whatever it is that is in front of you that you're appreciating together as a community. What we say is a little bit different. It's Baruch Haor Ba'olam, Baruch Haor Ba'adam, Baruch Haor Ba'Shabbat, which in this case is the Hebrew blessing for the lighting of candles, translated to blessed is the light of the world, blessed is the light of humanity, blessed is the light of Shabbat. And so we will say that prayer while we light the Shabbat candles, whether that be Friday night or Saturday morning. So we're taking the traditional pieces that work for us, the cultural pieces, and saying what we believe instead of praying to a God. And that is simply the difference. So are we deleting? I would say we're evolving. I would say that we're giving people what they need to hear when words are translated, when liturgy is translated from the Hebrew, so that we really understand what we're saying and walk our talk and appreciate humanity and each other because we know that we're here. We're grounded. This is our tradition. This is our culture. Shabbat means a day of peace. It means candles in a very metaphorical way. It means the fruit of the vine, whether that's grape juice or wine, in a very metaphorical way, the product of our labor. We're not all farmers. We live in the 21st century. We're not out growing our own wheat and harvesting grapes for our wine. But we are celebrating that as a very embedded element of Judaism that we value from the past. And so we're evolving that into saying we appreciate the labor, the work that we all do, and we're taking this day in community to celebrate it together.
So interesting. So did Rabbi Wine, or did somebody actually take the important texts of the Torah and evolve it, as you're saying?
So what we do is look at the Torah as one of the many historical books of Judaism and understand that it was written by many people over a long period of time. Are there wonderful elements of that we can use to inform our lives today? Absolutely. Is there folklore in Judaism that goes back thousands of years that can inform our life today, that can enrich our lives through telling of tales, through telling children stories and narratives that they can use to think about and embrace as part of their Jewish culture? Absolutely. Do we take those stories that have a deity? Can we stop this for a minute?
Pause the interview for just a few minutes for a very important phone call. I just want to return to how you were eloquently explaining the evolution in the actual text of a service. So was there anything more that you wanted to say about how that actually plays out in a real-time Jewish service?
So because we are a traveling congregation, and as I explained, our Shabbat services take those main elements of traditional Shabbat services minus what many would consider the most important piece, which is praying to God, following the commandment of observing Shabbat. We say, again, that we are respecting the cultural aspect of being Jewish and observing Shabbat. We don't have a Torah in an ark in a traditional synagogue. And so we can observe our Shabbats in various places, in various ways. Sometimes we're outdoors and being grateful and observant in nature. Sometimes we're in a church, and that's a convenient location that is comfortable for everybody who makes the decisions about locations. Sometimes we're in a home. And of course, being in a home, a bite for living, breathing people, as opposed to being in a bayit, also called a synagogue, is more comfortable for people who are not observant, religiously observant Jews. So our services travel, and our ability to do different types of services, sometimes in a more prayerful way, sometimes aligned with the observance of a Jewish holiday, and sometimes aligned with a guest speaker or presentation. Many of our presentations include current issues involving safety or aging or famous Jews in history, such as Jonas Salk or Richard Feynman, recent people we've focused on. Ernestine Rose, one of the suffragettes from U.S. history. People who identified as Jewish, but we know through our studies were also secular in their approach to Judaism. So we're looking at the historical context of Judaism, mostly in the United States, and saying there has always been that secular element. There have always been people who we now consider Jews, but maybe did Judaism in a different way. And we're proud to be part of that movement, that continuation.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about how this ties into Boulder, since we're in Boulder. First of all, when did you come to Boulder?
I moved to Boulder in the fall, late summer, early fall of 1975. I had completed a degree in special education and elementary education. I moved to Boulder with a friend and settled in at the New York Deli as a cook originally on Pearl Street, waiting for my teaching license to get processed through the Colorado Department of Education. And so in 1975, the fall was spent cooking and starting a class at what was Martin Park Elementary School, a class for autistic children. And that was my first Boulder teaching job, although I had taught for part of a year in New York previous to moving out here.
And what was it like to be Jewish in Boulder in 1975?
Very different than what it is now in 2012. Professionally, I had no Jewish colleagues at the time. So as a teacher, my New York City accent, my identification as a Jew, my wanting to maybe take a day off for a Jewish holiday was very foreign to the system that existed then. When I talked to other people about Jewish celebrations, or the fact that where I grew up in New York City, there were days off from school to commemorate Jewish holidays as well as Christian holidays, they were aghast, because that certainly didn't happen here at the time. When I tried to incorporate things that were Jewish in their orientation as far as folk tales or fairy tales, that in my teaching of folk tales and fairy tales using Jewish or Hebrew stories, I remember being told by someone that that was the same as teaching religion. So I found myself doing a lot of explaining, and in the course of explaining, we all learn better. So by teaching others about Judaism through my lens, I became a little bit more clear about who I was as a Jew at the time through my lens. And it was almost as if I was returning to a place of acknowledging my Judaism after being a teenager and young adult and avoiding it to a large degree.
And were there synagogues that you tried out?
Absolutely. So I did shul shopping over many years through many different phases. First as a single, and some of our current main congregations were just forming. At that time there was a Hillel at CU Boulder, but none of those really worked for me. I tried again when my children were young, preschool age. We went shul shopping, and I found that monitoring their reactions, it felt a little odd to them, and they weren't really comfortable with it. And that reflected my discomfort at some of that familiar liturgy that didn't really feel right, and some of the new liturgy that didn't feel right. I tried again when my children were a little older. There were new congregations forming, so at that point we had Orthodox options, conservative, reform. We had the renewal movement starting and flourishing as it is now in Boulder through Reb Zalman. We had a growing Hillel community on campus. There were interactions with other Jewish communities in Denver. There was a growing Jewish community center in Boulder, which continues to be a uniting force for Jews in our community and a wonderful place to be. But none of those opportunities actually worked. So I found myself either simply not bringing it up through friendships and professional interactions, or bringing it up very tentatively. It was very difficult for me to figure out not just that I was Jewish and claim it, but that I was a certain type of Jew. There was that almost subtle pressure to identify with a denomination or with a type of observance. And I wasn't identifying with a denomination, and I was not observing, other than kind of superficially at home, until getting involved with the Denver group and the Denver and Boulder groups forming Beth Ami, Colorado Congregation for Humanistic Judaism.
So you must have been thrilled.
It was very exciting.
Yeah.
So that evolution has brought me one regret, but that at that point, my children had sort of moved on. They were in high school. And so there was a little bit of personal sadness, and I had to go through some talking to myself, a little cognitive activity about who was I really being a Jew for? Was it for my children and my legacy, or was it for me? And I made the decision that it was for me, and that I could share it with my husband, and he was very willing to come along and be part of it, and that my personal involvement as a Jew had to be through this venue, So this became either an all or nothing opportunity for me, and I jumped on it to learn as much as I could. It felt good every step of the way, and I think that's how leadership grows. You learn more, you meet more people, it becomes a growing spiral of opportunity and joy and social satisfaction, as well as professional satisfaction, as well as intellectual growth, and it all felt right. So we had these growing bonds here in Denver with the Detroit community and society. We had visiting rabbis, and we grew as a congregation over the years until we're now what I would call a full-service community without a building.
And about how many people now participate in Boulder?
In Boulder, we have Boulder County, probably about 10 families. We have about another 10 to 15 families in Jefferson County, another group in the Denver area, and another smaller group south of Denver. But altogether, we do come together to participate in Jewish activity as a congregation.
I've read recently in several articles, several places, it's probably the hardest thing to be now in the United States is an atheist. Far more difficult than than being a Jew. What would you say about that?
I would say that this morning's Daily Camera had a wonderful article with some recent Pew religious research identifying 20% of the U.S. population as either atheist or spiritual without an affiliation as a Christian or other denomination of religion. And I cut it out. I read it. I'm going to reread it. I'm going to share it with my community. I think that in spite of our politics as a nation, we do have a growing awareness of the fact that people identify spiritually in many different ways, and that a cultural identification for some is their spirituality, is their continued practice. And I loved reading this article just today in the newspaper that this is a growing force in the United States, and I think that our institutions are going to start reacting to that. I think that we're going to see more cultural studies at the university level that include a secular practice of our main religions, whether it's a secular Muslim practice or a secular Christian practice or a secular Jewish practice. People have a hard time wrapping their brains around that idea because we consider those Abrahamic religions as God-based. But we do have rich cultural legacies from all of those areas that we can use today to inform who we are and what we do as humanists functioning in the world, as carriers of culture that identify us in some way without the theistic component that we traditionally relate.
It's very interesting because I've seen it more as that it's as if people are getting more and more spiritual and less religious. And you're saying there's a real possibility of people continuing in their religious track, but less spiritual.
Absolutely. So one of the ways I know that that's happening is that I'm part of a group that's very active in Boulder. There's a wonderful philanthropic organization called 18 Pomegranates, which I'm going to mention Francine Weaver as the mover and shaker behind that beautiful organization that helps fund a lot of Jewish initiatives in Boulder County. One of those more recent initiatives is Jewish Together Boulder. JT Boulder is a sponsor of a monthly meeting of the Jewish leaders of all the Jewish congregations in Boulder County. So we range from an Orthodox representative, a conservative representative, a Reform representative, renewal representatives, and I'm proud to say I'm now sitting around the table under the tent with these rabbis and other Jewish leaders in Boulder County. We are together involved with the wonderful annual June Boulder Jewish Festival on the courthouse lawn, which has become a mega event every year where people from all over Colorado attend to learn more about Jewish Boulder. We are also affiliated with another initiative through the Boulder Jewish Community Center called Schmoozers, in which one of my colleagues, Lenore Kingston, the director of our Jewish Cultural School, monthly sits around the table with the Jewish leaders of all the groups in Boulder County, talking about what they have coming up and how they can network together through advertising, through supporting each other financially, or through publicity, or just attending each other's events. The JT Boulder group is led by several women who are now scouring the literature, the academic and research literature of how communities bring in unaffiliated individuals. So our focus is on creating a vibrant, active, engaged Jewish community here in Boulder County. And all of these groups are not just doing that individually, but here in Boulder coming together to do it as a Jewish community in whatever form it takes for them personally. And so we are acknowledging here in Boulder that whole range of Jewish spirituality, whether it takes the form of traditional religion in an Orthodox manner, or whether it takes the form of secular Humanistic Judaism, which is what I'm representing and my colleagues are representing on these community-wide groups. But we're all being acknowledged as ways that people in the community can find us and be Jewish. And it's a very exciting time to be here in Boulder County.
Very different from 1975.
Right. No longer isolated, no longer functioning with a need to explain everything and wondering if I should self-identify, if I should come out of the Jewish closet and admit that I'm a Jew. Yeah. Now, say it loud, say it proud, I guess. And knowing that there are colleagues and like-minded people all around.
Yeah, it's just a remarkable evolution since 1975. What is that, like 40 years? I can't. Math is not my strong suit, but
almost.
It's really remarkable. And I can really see the stand that you've taken and the leader that you've been. I'm just curious. So how has your husband come along on the journey? I know you said he helped with the homeschooling, but how has he been?
He has friends now in our congregation, so he enjoys attending to meet and greet and visit with people with whom he's formed friendships. And so that's become part of his life, his social interactions. He also appreciates very much what we've done as a congregation, coming from a very traditional Catholic upbringing and having things that he still values from that background, but also things that he questions. So the idea of questioning your traditional upbringing, going through a process to create something that you can still live with comfortably while acknowledging the old ways, is a process he's personally going through with his Catholicism and enjoying making new friends along the way. He also is a very strong supporter of my life cycle events, so we might go up to the mountains and do a ceremony together, and he might attend, and we can sort of brainstorm afterwards what were the highlights of the wedding ceremony or the bar bat mitzvah ceremony that was performed, or as we just did last weekend, a new baby naming ceremony. So I've done 4 baby naming ceremonies, all with a humanistic bent, as well as an acknowledgement of some of the traditional ways of doing baby naming ceremonies in Jewish culture. Of course, those were not done for girls for centuries, and now for the last 100 years we have all sorts of liturgy that welcomes baby girls into the Jewish world, and we're constantly evolving what those ceremonies look like also.
So if I were to ask your husband, what's his name?
John.
John. If I were to ask John, what's your religious affiliation, what would he say?
He would say that he was born a Catholic, and that was his upbringing, and that today, I probably like his politics, he's an independent. That might be the best way to identify him.
He would say, I'm an independent.
Right.
Good for him. That's great. Are there any other accomplishments of which you're particularly proud that connect with this conversation about you as a leader of the secular humanist or humanist secular Jewish community?
You know, the humanistic term, I think, is the one that I embrace the most. I have a magnet on my fridge that says, help me before I volunteer again. I think I've always been a volunteer. And going back to my childhood memories, I trick-or-treated for UNICEF, for example. I lived in New York City. I knew about the United Nations I went to visit. As a child, I knew about the organization called UNICEF at a time when in elementary school we used to take milk cartons and wrap little orange banners around them and walk floor to floor just in our own apartment buildings,
and collecting pennies
for UNICEF. And so I grew up to be a UNICEF volunteer, and as an educator, a teacher of 31 years in Boulder Valley School District, I always incorporated the idea of world geography, kids helping kids, via UNICEF curriculum in my programming. So in each school I worked in Boulder County, in Boulder Valley School District, over my 31-year career, I always tried to incorporate some sort of charitable effort through UNICEF so that in the fall kids participated and had an educational component as well as a fundraising component related to UNICEF, an organization that children can always identify with. This coming Saturday morning, I'll be doing a Shabbat service for my congregation for families that will include a UNICEF video and literature and an opportunity to receive collection boxes and go out and trick-or-treat for UNICEF because it is October and Halloween is coming up and we want to make it more meaningful for kids. So that legacy of volunteering and enriching a more traditional U.S. type of activity like trick-or-treating on Halloween can then be broadened to enrich the lives of kids in a humanistic way. My teaching career is something that I'm very proud of. And I had wonderful, amazing opportunities to work as a teenager in what we might call the disabled or differently abled communities, starting at the age of 14 at a camp in New York called Camp Venture, a place in the sun for everyone. And it was truly for everyone. I spent 5 summers as a counselor and swim director, embracing and learning about children with different ways of living their lives and different disabilities. I attended Buffalo State College in my formative years in the Learning and Behavioral Disorders program. So I graduated, finished my undergrad degree with a degree in Learning Behavioral Disorders and Elementary Education, did all my interning in inner city Buffalo, and left with that combination of recreational ideas as well as pedagogy for teaching. And that's when I moved to Boulder and became a special education teacher. So again, that humanistic way of living your life by serving others, by being a special ed teacher for 23 years, is really my identity. That's who I am. After that 23 years, I mentored new teachers in Boulder Valley School District and had the great opportunity to travel all around the school district, focused on middle school teachers, which became my niche. After that 3 years was over, I landed at Casey Middle School, a wonderful bilingual middle school in Boulder, where I worked for 4 years before retiring, and had the great opportunity to become immersed in our wonderful, mostly Mexican, but community of immigrants in Boulder, where my limited Spanish was put to use, but mostly my embracing of other cultures, and being part of a community that was truly bilingual, bicultural again, and serving a community that was impoverished in many ways, in our well-to-do community, sort of a a community within a community was a fabulous opportunity. And I still go back and substitute teach at Boulder and at Casey Middle School, which is my home away from home. I love the climate and the population there. And that led me to the I Have a Dream program of Boulder County, which now serves also mostly children of poverty whose parents did not attend college, and many of whom are second language learners, English language learners, whose parents are Mexican immigrants or who were either born here or in Mexico. Those kids are receiving an opportunity, a grab at higher education through the I Have a Dream program, which now operates 7 adopted classes all around Boulder County.
Fabulous.
So I've taken my educational skills and I train tutors who work with the kids in the I Have a Dream program, and also tutor myself there.
And I've heard you participate in Reading to End Racism.
So that was another wonderful opportunity that arose, mostly in my move to Casey Middle School while I was still a teacher. They had already embraced the Reading to End Racism program, which was running strong with a volunteer force in Boulder County in Boulder Valley School District. And I worked to continue that program at Casey Middle School and then joined the board for several years and did presentations myself. Again, mostly for that middle school population that a lot of people are a little fearful of, but I find myself home with those kids.
Well, you are one amazing, accomplished, and contributing woman. It's an honor to interview you. Is there
Thank you,
anything else that you want to make sure gets captured on tape?
I think that the final message is to live our lives in the here and now. My belief system is that there's really nothing waiting for me afterwards. So as a surprise spiritual leader of a community, that's the message I prefer to give people, whether I'm with my congregation or with my students or in a volunteer capacity. Let's do it now. Let's help each other now. Let's be grateful for our lives now and acknowledge those people around us that make our lives special and wonderful. Enjoy nature and our natural gifts. Enjoy our intellectual gifts and mostly each other. Thank you.
Thank you.